All right, thanks, folks, for being willing to do this way for today's lecture. Sorry about the change in plans, and so if you happen to hear me cough or something during this, that wouldn't be surprising. So hopefully, I can keep that to a minimum, though. But moving forward here, the reminders here is we have this concept check 1A. It's pretty short and sweet. That is set to be due Wednesday night. It's primarily a bunch of questions related to genetic drift, which is a topic we talked about last time and we'll rehash again now. And then looking ahead, we've got another concept check 1B, as well as the mini project, the first mini project. This is the one mini project that can't be dropped. It's a mini project on building your own simple genetic algorithm. Those right now are scheduled for February 9th is the due date for those. So that's kind of what is to be expected. Otherwise, any other questions about assignments or other admin? I will say the perusal assignment from the replacement for Thursday's lecture I thought was very good. I appreciated the comments and questions that came in there. So I hope that was useful to read that chapter. And it kind of is what we're setting up in today and on Thursday's lecture is sort of rounding out that genetic algorithm, the basic GA, and talking about elaborations of the GA to answer some of the problems with the GA that come from it just being an evolutionary algorithm. So to get back on that track, let's go ahead and recall. And by the way, since we're in this format, I've got the chat up here, and of course, I've got the earpiece in. So if you have questions, feel free to put a question in the chat. If you raise a hand, I should hopefully see that in the participants list. That should also work. But yeah, feel free to raise those questions as we go. I'll do my best to keep looking up and down as I go through here. All right, so recall from the last couple times that we're dealing with evolutionary algorithms, and so it's important for us to talk about evolution. And we defined evolution as the change, I guess I should say, is. So evolution is the change in allele or strategy distribution. And by distribution, I just mean the frequency um, in a population over time. And that comes from thinking about that in a living systems perspective. It's the change in these genetic variants in a population over time. So, there might be 10% of the population has got this variant, and the other 90% of the population has got another variant. But then, for reasons which we would discuss in future generations, that 10 becomes 15 and the 90 becomes 85. That's evolution. So an evolutionary algorithm then is, it works by reshaping the distribution of a population of potential solutions. Hopefully, so that good solutions tend to be found by the process. So the key word here really is population. So an evolutionary algorithm doesn't have to use genes necessarily. An evolutionary algorithm is a type of search method through this parameter space that is built upon the idea that rather than doing one search at a time or multiple searches that are independently in parallel, we're going to do a bunch of parallel searches that are somehow coupled together so that as you evaluate a bunch of different possible solutions and then look at how they relate to each other, that will then inform you on what the next volley of solutions to try in the next, so that you hopefully that population can start reaching perhaps some agreement around good solutions. So it's in the end of an evolutionary algorithm, you don't get one solution out, you get a population of solutions, which may all converge around one solution, or as we'll start to see, like in the multi-objective algorithms that will come up soon, then actually the population you get at the end of the algorithm is a portfolio of solutions that characterize different trade-offs between multiple objectives. That's getting a little more advanced, but it just goes to show that once you start thinking in a population sense, it allows you to do a lot more interesting things through this search space. So that's kind of a review there. So the evolutionary algorithm is what we're doing here. And so because this is based on evolution, then it's important for us to know what are the different ways that those distributions can change. So these are the so-called forces of evolution. So we have, oops, and there are four basic forces of evolution. So in natural systems, these are processes that will cause the distribution of alleles to change from one generation to another over time. For us, when we're building algorithms, then you can view these as ways to move or search. I could say move through, maybe. I'll just say ways to change the population of possible solutions in an EA, in an evolutionary algorithm. So the kind of dumbest way that we could think of doing that, if you imagine what's the dumbest way to search through a parameter space, it's just by moving randomly through it. I'm going to just start here and I'm going to take a random movement somewhere else. And then I'm going to evaluate that position. And then so I'm going to try, if I'm trying to find the optimal PID controller of some control circuit, regulating how fast an elevator moves up and down an elevator shaft. Well, I'm just going to randomly try the P gain is one, the I gain is one, and the D gain is one. See how well that does in my performance metric. And then from there, I'm just going to randomly change those to 3, 7, and 6, and then try that. And do that over and over and over again. Well, that is certainly one way that you can change these strategies from generation to generation, where every generation is kind of a new volley of trials. And that corresponds to mutation, where here, this is the spontaneous generation of genotype changes. So I'll say genotype or solution changes. And this came up in the perusal. I think I mentioned last week that radiation could be something that caused this, but there's a bunch of different mechanisms that can cause mutations. In natural systems, the process of copying and repairing DNA is error prone. And so there are all of these processes that can introduce new errors or just changes, and those kind of count as this mutation. So there's sort of many mechanisms in nature, but for us, we just sort of we kind of design probability distributions. So when we say we want to make a mutation out of a particular gene, then we might say that what we're going to do is we're going to go to that gene, that decision variable, and we're going to add a certain amount of noise to it. So we're going to add a random number between 1 and 6, and a uniformly distributed random number between 1 and 6, or between -6 and 6. And that's how we do mutation. So we don't actually sort of care about what an analogous mechanism is in a natural system, but natural systems have a bunch of different mechanisms to do it, but in the end, they just generate spontaneous changes in the genotype. That's the whole point of mutation. There's another one that we haven't talked about, and we won't really get into until a little bit later, but it does show up in genetic algorithms: migration and gene flow. So this is the introduction of new individuals or new strategies from another location. So in natural systems, you often get this partitioning where you have a bunch of individuals, or a bunch of a group that has been isolated from another group for a long amount of time, but then suddenly that isolation is removed, or there's a pathway between the two, and you get gene flow. You start getting a movement of some from one area into another, and they might have had completely different adaptations in that other area, or just completely different outcomes of genetic drift, something we haven't gotten into yet here, in that other area. So there are different solutions that tend to be overrepresented in the one population versus the other population. And so gene flow is a way of introducing some of those from one to another. As we'll learn in a little bit later in another unit, there are ways of partitioning these evolutionary algorithms into subpopulations, and reasons why you might want to do that, and then occasionally allowing them to mix. And that will generate this version of migration or gene flow. Although this is one of the four major forces of evolution that, if you look up in any life sciences textbook or biology textbook, you'll see that. Right now, for this unit, we're not going to focus much at all about migration or gene flow, but I want to at least mention it there because it will come up later, and it's certainly important if we're just talking about evolution more broadly. Then otherwise, I just kind of hinted at it: genetic drift. This is a really hard one for people to understand initially. And so I would expect questions about genetic drift. And so if you do have questions about where this comes from and things like that, then you shouldn't hesitate to ask them. It's not an easy concept, but this is the change in frequency of an allele due to random chance. And I want to emphasize that it's a fair random chance. It is not due to selection. So this is, I'm going to say, not selection. And so I was mentioning this in terms of limitation, but I can also kind of give a different example. Like, I could say an example, um, you could have an individual has bad luck and gets stepped on, by a, so I'm just going in terms of like a bug, gets stepped on and squished by a human passing by. So in this particular case, and I see the question, I'll get to that in a second, that if you have a bunch of insects that are in a forest and you're walking through them, if you happen to step on one of them, you're not stepping on them because they have any particular trait. I mean, it might be that the ones that happen to know to stay away from you are going to do better, and that gets a little more complicated. But if you just imagine that a bunch of insects where they all don't have any way to know to get away from you, and you just non-discriminately just kind of step on some of them, then those will be removed from the population. And that random process may end up, especially in small populations, may end up changing the distribution of alleles. And just because it's not a continuous process. And so if there were an equal number, there were 10 individuals that were blue and there are 10 individuals that were red. And when you stepped on them, you didn't happen to step on an equal number of blue and red individuals. So after you step on them, there's going to be more blue than red or more red than blue. And so that is totally random and not due to the trait themselves. That is the idea of genetic drift. And then likewise, I've mentioned about limitation. If you imagine everyone has the ability to potentially reproduce, but only the individuals that can manage to find the food get to actually have those offspring survive to their own reproduction, then you could imagine that once you hit the sort of carrying capacity for the habitat, once all of the food is eaten, anyone that didn't happen to get to there first in the race doesn't get to have offspring that survive to reproduction. Now, if they all had traits that were equally good at getting to the food, there was just a finite amount of food, then those who don't get the food, it's just totally random. It's just bad luck. So that's what we are kind of differentiating here is that if you have traits that make you more likely to do well, then that's going to be binned into natural selection, which we'll get to in the next page. But if the thing that removed you from the population is something that could have removed anyone from the population, and it wasn't due to your traits in particular, that's random chance and that's genetic drift. So there's a question in the chat. So basically, genetic drift is not affected by anything external like mutation and migration. Well, I mean, I would say that genetic drift can be caused by external things, like somebody walking through a forest. But we would say that the person walking through the forest, that is not they're not generating changes in alleles due to mutation, um, or they're not doing it during a gene flow. In the forest example, a mutation example would be that a beetle has an offspring that, due to a problem in how the DNA was copied, then the offspring of that beetle happens to have a slightly different structure on their leg. That's like a mutation because that was generated internal to the animal. The migration example would be there's all blue beetles in the forest, and then red beetles are in another forest, and a red beetle happens to find her way into that forest. There's a clarification. Yeah, I should have specified that nothing affects them externally due to their genetic makeup. It's just random. Yes, it's just random. Genetic drift is kind of the box that holds all of the things that are not trait related, and it's just random chance. The question: color of skin and evolution. So we're going to get to this, but that if your skin provides you no selective advantage, then the color of skin is definitely a trait that whose distribution can be set by genetic drift. So if you're in an area where there are people who are white, brown, black, etc., different skin colors, and in that area, I mean, there are, like, for example, people with black skin have more melanin in their skin than people with white skin. And so if you're in an area where you need more protection from the sun, it may be an advantage for you to have a certain color of skin. But if you're in an area where your skin provides you no advantage whatsoever, and the color of skin that you produce isn't costly. So you might imagine, like, maybe there's blue skin that's out there, but maybe it's like it's so much more energetically costly to produce blue skin. Well, in that case, unless you absolutely needed blue skin for some reason in the habitat, camouflage or something like that, then anyone making blue skin, they would be less successful as anyone else, and then they would gradually get selection would pull them out. So if the trait has no selective advantage or no differential cost, then that trait will evolve likely due to drift. And what might happen there is you might get a population of people with all one skin color and another population isolated from them with all another skin color. And those two populations, even though they differ in skin color, they just arrived there both by random chance. So that's what I'm going to write down here in a second, is that drift is a random process you can model with a Markov chain whose absorbing states that attract all trajectories to one of these absorbing states are states of so-called fixation. And I'll write this down here, and that is where everyone is the same. So all of those equivalent traits, basically only one of those equivalent traits gets picked, and that one ends up spreading through the whole population. The population reaches fixation, and at that point, there's no opportunity for random chance to change anything because it doesn't matter who you squish. Everybody you squish looks the same. So yeah, so it all depends on whether there is an advantage for it, and if there's no selective advantage, it's probably going to be drift. Otherwise, it won't be. And so, as we'll get into here towards the end of this lecture, then what we're going to see is that things that start out being selected will end up being drifted because selection naturally makes populations less diverse, but selection also will converge upon solutions that are very similar to each other in terms of fitness. And once solutions are very similar to each other, then there's nothing selection can do anymore. Any further evolution is going to be due to drift. So hopefully that makes sense. So let me write some of that stuff down, and then happy to take more questions about it. So, because drift affects all individuals equally, traits with larger numbers are more likely to persist. And I hope that makes sense. And I see the question there. I'll get to that in a second. Is that if you have, if what this is basically saying is if you have a bunch of white coins and a bunch of filled in coins, and here I clearly have more filled in coins than white coins. If you randomly select one of them or several of them to be removed from the population, then it is unlikely that it is more likely that you are going to create a balance shift toward the dark coins than the light coins. So if it's equally likely that I can hit any of these here, then in the next generation or after the drift operator has happened here, then it's like the only way that white would benefit from drift is if I hit just all of the non-white ones. But if I'm hitting them equally, then there's an equal chance that there is there's nothing that shelters white. So the only safety you get from drift is in your numbers. And so the if I've got only four coins, if I only have one coin and drift happens to hit it, then it goes extinct. That trait does not exist in the population. But if I've got 99 coins like that, a little drift isn't going to matter. So drift favors traits that already have a slight advantage in terms of numbers in a population. And then it will drift toward fixation. That number will get larger and larger and larger. It will tend to until eventually your population is full of just the one that has higher numbers. So there was a question. So to sum up, genetic drift is non-genetic external forces that randomly favors one population than another. And I wouldn't even use the word favor, but I would say it just randomly it randomly removes individuals from a population regardless of their traits. So it is the natural change in allele frequency when there is no selective pressure. So given that you're going to have things that are going to cause some individuals to live or die by bad luck alone. So genetic drift really you could associate it. This is the I'll just say the bad luck force. So regardless of how well you prepare for some things, sometimes there's just bad luck. And so genetic drift captures that. No matter how well suited you are for that environment, there is always a chance that you're just gonna happen to get, hit by some weird random event. And if there are a lot of you that share that strategy, then that strategy will stick around. But if there aren't that many of you that share that strategy and you happen to be the one that hit, then you get extinct. So people in certain continents developing dark skin might not be due to drift, but people in the same continent developing two sets of different colors might be due to drift. Well, so the if there is if those populations on the same continent are intermingled, if they're together, then if there really is no advantage to one skin color or the other in that habitat, in that environment, then we would expect um, one color to end up dominating, end up drifting to fixation, just because of this Markov chain process, where if they all start out equal, eventually one of them is going to become unequal. Once one of them becomes unequal, then it will be more likely to gain than lose in the next generation, and so on and so forth, until eventually this process drifts to hitting this absorbing boundary, and then that one color takes over. But there are other processes related to natural selection that can stabilize two, say, for example, skin colors in the same population. Um, even egg and sperm, for example, the the ancestor of egg and sperm is thought to be a single gamete that basically is a non-sexless gamete. So this sort of one, rather than having a small sperm and a large egg, there was this, and there are some organisms that still have this, is that they just had one thing, but then there was a trade-off where if you could grow larger, you could provide more resources and better control the development of the eventual offspring. But you lost your mobility, your motility. But if you could grow smaller, then you could actually make more mating events. But you would lose the ability to have resources and control over that. So these became two solutions that that it's called disruptive selection, where where both could coexist because they both were sort of using different aspects of the trade-off space. And that's how we got for animals, modern animals, almost all of animals, have a two-sex system where we have a small gamete and a large gamete. So that's an example where in one large population, you can get, two strategies that coexist. But drift doesn't favor coexistence. Drift is a force that removes diversity. And I could say that this adds diversity, and also mutation adds diversity. There was a question, how do you define bad luck? Is there a proper definition based on evolutionary logic? I mean, bad luck is just the things that we can't model due to selection. So you can say like, well, why did that bird you know, why did that bird's off like why did that bird have five offspring? And you could say, well, it actually had six offspring, but one of them got run over by a truck or something like that. Well, that's bad luck. But if you can say, well, why did that bird have five offspring? And say, well, that bird is less efficient than another bird, and so it wasn't able to use its food as much. And so instead of building six offspring, it only was able to build five. So if you're less efficient and you make five offspring, then you that might be under selection. And the one that is more efficient that could make six offspring with the same amount of food might be selected for. But if you made six offspring, but one just got run over by a tractor, and that, that like that could have happened to anybody, then in that case, it's bad luck. So bad luck means could happen to any trait. It is not selective for the particular trait. I might be reading a bit forward, but how do we model drift in the GA? And if so, how? Or can we, because we can't randomly remove members from the population, given the population size remaining constant? So drift, as we'll see, that because we have a fixed population size, we automatically get drift in a genetic algorithm because you can't like in a we when we're going to say that certain individuals are more fit, meaning they have more offspring than other individuals. But ultimately, we only can put them into a fixed number of slots. So we're going to basically create, you can think of it, excuse me, pardon, you can think of it as creating a fictitious population that is much, much larger than the slots that we can put things in, that is populated by the growth of all of these different traits, some that grow more than others. But then overall, then after we have that population, then we need to shove them all back down into the 20 or so population slots that we have left. And that process is effectively a process of genetic drift. It's going to draw from that population of offspring that is much larger than the population of the parent generation. But the draws from the offspring generation will be just totally random. But the demographics of the offspring generation, that's going to be due to fitness. And so those that are really good solutions will have more representation in the offspring and thus will be more likely to make it through drift. So that bottleneck process of shoving things into an array, that ends up generating drift. Or another way to view generating drift, as we'll talk about, as some of you read already, most of the selection operators that we use in the genetic algorithm are random. They draw randomly from a distribution. And so, even though some individuals will have really, really high fitness and they will be very likely to be drawn to continue on to the next generation, there is a chance that they won't be. There's a chance that a lower fitness individual will be picked. I mean, when you're throwing darts at a dartboard, um, if you blindfold and throw darts at a dartboard, there is a chance you're going to hit the bullseye, even though it is a really, really tiny spot. So that's where we get drift. Okay, great. All right, so this, I just want to highlight that point that um, traits with larger numbers are more likely to persist if drift is the only thing that's playing. So it has a tendency to grow the subpopulation with the biggest numbers, and it purges genetic diversity. So these ones are adding diversity, drift is purging diversity. So the termination of that, so drift leads to uh, a population that has all the same individuals. So we'll say drift leads to fixation of a population on one allele. And you could say, well, do I mean allele or genotype? And that goes into the genotypic architecture, and it's a little more an advanced topic. But let's just assume that we can imagine alleles somehow operating independently from each other. But then drift is saying that if be, that this is a stable equilibrium of random bad luck, an absorbing state of basically a Markov chain, if you're sort of keeping track of the numbers of individuals in each trait. So you're like, oh, I got trait A, B, and C, so if you imagined, how many are in A, how many are in B, how many are in C, then you might get some numbers here, 5, 3, and 2. And then, this over time, will you end up getting, like an absorbing state to that might be that the number would be that all 10 of those are in A, or are in B, or are in C. And what do I mean by that is if now you apply the random, the random operator to this. So if you allow them to reproduce, they're all going to produce roughly the same number of offspring. And then now if you randomly, kill some of those in order to squeeze them back down into your finite population size or carrying capacity, you don't change the distribution. So that's what we mean by it's a stable equilibrium here, and that these are sort of the states there that this can converge to. We can't predict, which one. So cannot generally predict which allele will win the drift race. That's just my term to fixation. But larger numbers are a good indicator. And this suggests so-called neutral theories of evolution, where there's early in kind of the development of evolutionary theory, people like Matu Kimura and some other folks, population geneticists, start to realize that there are a bunch of diverse traits that you observe in the real world, looking at tree canopies and things like that, forests, plants, microbes, that the actual traits that seem to dominate don't seem to be particularly strong traits or obviously adaptive or or anything really exciting or special about them. And if you happen to find isolated subpopulations, you find that they tend to select alternative traits that seem to be doing just as well. And so these neutral theories of evolution said, well, maybe we can actually predict if there are a bunch of traits that don't provide any special advantage, what might the distribution be if we kind of try to figure out, well, what genes are they on and what is sort of, other sorts of how much, what's the mutation rate and so on. So, these basically said, well, what if you like combined, mutation and drift, and then you'd say, what patterns result? And they found that that actually was a pretty good predictor of some populations. And so rather than saying that, wow, this was selected, this particular trait was really good, and that's why it's everywhere, then as they're saying, well, actually, just with, if you model this with a little bit of mutation and with drift, you get very similar patterns that come about. And it's in this it's these are just as good as other things that happen to not like this. These ones that stuck around were the ones that were sort of the ones that benefited from good luck, and the ones that were equally, good at in performance just happened to wither away due to bad luck. So there are whole theories, neutral theories of evolution, which are about trying to predict, what sort of patterns you get when you don't have selective pressure, because things are roughly equal. So this is something that when we're using genetic algorithms, we have to be very careful that if we do see that a certain population tends to have converged around a particular set of solutions, it's a good idea to run the GA second time from new initial conditions. And if it also converges to that same set, then maybe that gives you some confidence that there's something good about that. But it might converge to a different set, and that'd be kind of like two separate subpopulations that drift away to different fixation points. So that's something you have to keep in mind, is that this, just because your population is in agreement doesn't mean that that's actually a good solution. That just means that it's probably not a bad solution. But you shouldn't interpret that as it's like super great because everybody is converged to it, because that just could be an outcome of drift. Okay. So then that brings us to selection, natural selection, which is another one of these which purges diversity, so removes diversity. And so here we define fitness of an individual to be the number of offspring individuals with that genotype tend to produce. So in a natural setting, I'd probably say on average. I would say within their environment. And I say that because in a natural system, a genotype that is really successful in one environment may not be so successful in another environment. And in our cases, you can find that the way you parameterize, there could be a design for a car. Well, if the optimization objective is to win a race, that's very different than the optimization objective to maximize the comfort of the driver inside. And so if you're trying to select parameters of your car, then those two different optimization objectives are like two different environments. And so strategies for winning the race are going to be more fit in in that environment, and strategies that make for a gentle ride will be more fit in the other environment. But they probably aren't the same strategies. So, that environment interaction is important. So, um, the way natural selection works is that individuals have different fitness, and that, so they basically place different number of offspring into next generation. And so this changes the distribution of alleles. And this is why a lot of times when people talk about natural selection, they say it's not fitness that matters so much, but relative fitness. So if you normalize your fitness to the average fitness, so when we talk about modeling these systems, when we talk population genetics or whatever, then we usually talk about average fitness, which is how much does the population grow on average? And then you can sort of say, okay, relative to that, how much did you grow? And if you grew less than that, then that means that your allele is going to be less represented in the next generation. If you grew more than that, then that means that your allele is going to be more represented in the next generation. And so, um, and then so that suggests that, that there's going to be changes in these alleles. When there are very large changes from one generation to the next, then we refer to that as that environment having a high selective pressure. So selective pressure is when an environment generates very large changes in allele distribution due to um, fitness differences. Or I'd say due to performance or quality, something along those lines. But the point I'm getting at here is that that there's there's going to be some cases where there's if you're the high selective pressure might mean that that it's a trait that is really, really important for you to have, or you to avoid having, or to have multiple copies of, and so on. And if you have that, then you're at a huge advantage. And so there's huge selective pressure for you to have that. Very often, selective pressure goes in the other way, where you get a lot of evolutionary processes that will generate ratcheting effects. And what I mean by that is like you'll get like a gene duplication. And so now you've got two genes inside an individual that are doing the same job. Well, then as these two genes are doing the same job, then one of them can be mutated and stop doing the job as well, and it starts doing another job. And it can do that because that first gene is still doing the right job. Well, then the other gene can also mutate so that it doesn't do the job that the other one's doing. So then now you get these two that are this kind of division of labor between the two of them there. Well, now they're kind of stuck there. You can't ever kind of go back to that. And there ends up being this sort of high selective pressure on maintaining that function. So, undoing the mutations would end up putting a huge cost. So selective pressure represents there's high costs or high benefits. I guess I'll say that's another way to say that is there's high costs or high benefits. And it's important to note that this will decrease as natural selection acts. And this goes back to relative fitness. So the idea here is that if you have one individual that is so much better than all the others, then that individual will take over the whole population. It will produce so many offspring that the whole population will look just like that one individual with slight variations. Well, then at that point, all of those offspring don't perform much differently from each other. So it's really hard for any one of them to get a leg up. So you end up getting you don't get a massive change in the allelic distribution any further, so the natural selection pressure kind of burns itself out. So there's kind of this kind of selective fuel that just kind of drives this engine of natural selection until the fuel is like not there anymore. And at that point, once it burns itself out and there's very little fitness difference between these, drift will take over. And that's what we'll draw here in a diagram. So any questions about that? All right, so I can capture that whole message here to say that if we think about evolutionary algorithms or evolution in general, but we're focusing on evolutionary algorithms here, then we've got these kind of two axes that I can start with here. Well, I'll call this the effectiveness effectiveness of an evolutionary algorithm, EA, to find good solutions. And on this axis, I've got selective pressure. So what I'm saying is that over here, I basically have high population diversity. So a lot of interesting new different strategies. Over here, I have low population diversity. All the strategies look similar. And so if there's a lot of diversity, you're way over here, then what's going to happen is you follow this path, which basically looks like an arc like this, where if you start with high selective pressure, you just get lower and lower selective pressure as you select the better and better candidates, and the candidates that are left over end up not being that different from each other. So um, basically here, you have a natural shift toward lower diversity. And so what this looks like when you're building an evolutionary algorithm is that, let's just say you've got a optimization objective that you're trying to minimize, for example. So let's say I want to minimize. We've got f of x that I would like to minimize. And let's say this f of x, the key features here is it's going to have a bunch of valleys, hills and valleys, where one is going to be particularly much lower than another. So it doesn't matter quite how you draw this, but this is what I'll draw here. All right, so ideally, this is the best solution. But if I were to start with a population that was near this peak over here where I'm drawing, then I hope you could see that due to the steep line there is high selective pressure, so that these individuals will very quickly converge around this point right here. So quick convergence. And that makes sense locally, but that's not great globally. So that's the downside of selective pressure, is that you can get premature convergence. But then on the flip side of that, over in the low population diversity side, down my x, and in this case, I'll still do an f of x that I'll say we're minimizing. But now I'm going to draw one that is got kind of a long sort of flat region. So if I've got this kind of f of x that's relatively flat, and then maybe it's got a dip here, then ideally this is the best point that I'd like to find. But if I happen to start my individuals out over here, then here there's very little selective pressure because they're very close together in fitness. So they may not actually move very much at all. You may just get the population that's just going to sit there. And we can refer to that as stagnation. And then furthermore, because there's, basically no fitness difference, so I'll say delta F is close to zero, then that means that it's going to give way to drift. And so that will lead to fixation on one strategy. So not only are you getting rid of selective pressure as you travel this curve, but over here, you might actually be giving way to drift as well. So I could say here, enter drift. So ideally, as we look at the genetic algorithm and how it's designed, and we think about all of these hyperparameters that we're going to go into detail into between today, where we're just going to start introducing the GA, and then on Thursday, we'll go into more detail. What we would like to do is to choose hyperparameters to stay in this region as long as possible. So this is sort of this ideal balance. And this is something that is achieved through in the GA by choosing the right selection operator. So as we'll talk about, using like fitness scaling, ranking, etc. So we want to be sensitive to, and if I want to phrase this in maybe more, optimization cases here, over here is too sensitive to changes in objective value. That's kind of this side here. And then, over here is too little diversity for good search. And so we're always fighting these things, trying to maintain diversity as long as possible, in such a way that we don't accidentally, while we're also trying to favor, not trying to favor one good solution. I know there's just a lot of balancing act that has to go into it. And as we get into more complex algorithms like multi-objective algorithms, then we find that all of these things become even more important. And then we'll start introducing diversity maintenance tools that are even more explicit, and then that go beyond what we need in a standard and this sort of simple GA. All right. So questions about that diagram? All right. So there's that diagram. If I want to add in all of those other forces, then you get this diagram. So I've drawn this one up and put this online in the unit. And I guess I could draw this manually here, but maybe I'll just highlight here. Maybe I'll make this a little bigger. If I want to combine all four forces, well, not migration, if I want to combine mutation, drift, and selection all together to describe how an EA works, this is what you get. This is the conceptual model that you should have in mind. And this is what, when you're designing or choosing hyperparameters, this is the conceptual model to have in mind. So the things to highlight here is that along this axis here, I've got my diversity and fitness selective pressure, just like on the previous diagram. And then, but over here now, I'm plotting that against diversity in genotype. So now I've specifically separated out basically genotype diversity and phenotype diversity, because there could be multiple genotypes that are equally fit. But generally speaking, you can't have multiple genotypes that are, you can't have different fitness unless you have different genotypes, although you can have different genotypes with the same fitness. So they're related for sure. So when there is a lot of, over here on this side of the axis, that means that there are a bunch of individuals that differ way a lot in fitness. So that means one of those individuals potentially could just knock out all of the other ones because it's so much better than those others. Whereas up here, we aren't saying anything about their fitness necessarily. In fact, along this line, we're sort of saying there's no difference in fitness, but we're saying up at this level here, then there's just a huge variety of strategies. When they're sitting on this line, there are a variety of strategies that have equal fitness. They work just as well. But just along this line, is saying that all of these strategies, they differ, and all the decision variables are very different. Now, if we didn't apply mutation, and if we didn't apply natural selection, we just let the sort of process of evolution go, there would be random events that would knock out certain individuals and not others. And so that's drift. So there is a constant drift force that is pulling everything down towards the origin, purging both phenotypic diversity and genotypic diversity from the population. That's just the background. It's always there. So, that's always there. And you can, in there's a region here where I can add natural selection. And natural selection should hopefully select for better solutions. But I hope you see now that as selection operates, it reduces the fitness diversity. So if it started out here, natural selection will move it this way, and it will eventually get to a point here, which I didn't mark on it here, but I'll call this, I'm just going to, this is traditionally called the drift barrier. And there's actually an ASU faculty member named Mike Lynch, who's sort of a famous person who's done research into the drift barrier and all of its implications. And so this drift barrier right here, that's our drift barrier. So if you started out with this sort of fitness, you end up moving to this drift barrier. And at that drift barrier, beyond the drift barrier, drift is a more dominating force than natural selection. So at this point, there is so little difference in your fitness that those that are slightly more fit than the others theoretically should get more representatives in the next generation. But because the fitness is implemented with some randomness, then that randomness, it's sort of that signal gets buried in the noise. So this is sort of the signal to noise ratio, or the noise floor. So that if the diversity gets too low, you go below the drift barrier. And in this region of phenotypic diversity and fitness diversity, it's all drift. It doesn't matter if you have a selection operator or not. At this point, you're going to purge diversity in your system through drift. Now you can rescue the system through mutation. And so remember, mutation is one of the few things that adds diversity. So you so so that creates a force moving roughly in this direction. So that is it's primarily adding diversity in genotype, and then it's hopefully adding at least a little bit diversity in phenotype, but it's definitely adding diversity in genotype. That's what mutation is doing here. So that is rescuing, that's pushing against the drift force. And where drift force and mutation come to equilibrium, that's those so-called neutral theories of evolution that I was talking about. All right, so all of these things go together. And so you've got selection, which is pulling you this way. Drift is pulling you this way. So how do you make a algorithm work? Well, hopefully you start the algorithm off over here. So at this point, you've got high diversity in genotype and hopefully high diversity in phenotype. So you've got a bunch of individuals that have very different strategies that all perform very differently. And so as they perform differently, then the really bad ones are going to get moved out, and the new ones are going to be brought back in. And so you're going to gradually get rid of those bad ones and then start converging on a bunch of solutions which look very similar to each other, but then need to get fine-tuned. So then you fine tune them, and so at this point their genotypic diversity isn't going to be that different. That's why this becomes kind of horizontal. But then the fitness diversity is going to get lower and lower and lower until eventually it leads over here and they go to fixation somewhere. So that's kind of the curve that you want out of a good functioning evolutionary algorithm, starting up here and going down here. And we can view this top corner as an exploration corner. This is where large movements are made in the decision space. In this lower corner, this is where fine tuning is done. That's the kind of exploitation corner. And then intelligent search kind of goes away here. At this point, it's just all drift. So those are the things you have to think about. And I'm aware of time here, but um, when we design these operators. And so there's a natural speed accuracy trade-off that you can kind of keep in mind here, where um, if you want to maintain exploration in the presence of drift, that's great. You can add mutation. But the larger you make mutation, then the harder it is for you to find fine scale differences. So your space is going to keep you out of this exploitation region. You're not going to be able to fine tune. So if you want to be able to find fine-tuned solutions that are really, well fit for your environment, really the best way to do that is to reduce the size of this region. Well, how do you do that? Create very large populations, because the size of this region is determined by population size. So this model, once you get it in your head, gives you kind of a way to sort of think about what's going to happen if I increase the mutation rate? What's going to happen if I increase the population size? And so on and so forth. What's going to happen if I increase the selective pressure? You should try to get in your head navigating through this space, and then that helps you decide on setting those hyperparameters when you pull up your GA. All right, I want to stop there for today's lecture. Are there any questions? If not, then on Thursday, we'll do a deep dive into the stuff you've been reading about from the last time there, which is how to, how to implement the actual GA. God, thanks. Hopefully I'll, move in the right trajectory. Hopefully we'll be up to speed back on Thursday. All right. Well, if any other questions come up, feel free to email. Otherwise, bring them up on Thursday and we'll talk to you later. Have a good day.